This video is a conversation that I had with Andrés Gómez Emilsson. Now, Andrés is primarily the co-founder of the Qualia Institute, which is a research organization that's investigating things like psychedelics and consciousness and just how we can reduce human suffering and sort of maximize human flourishing. And I am really excited to be able to bring in this conversation. Andrés is, well, first of all, just an awesome guy, extremely intelligent. He's got a very comprehensive CV. He has a master's from Stanford in computational psychology. He was a co-founder of the Stanford Transhumanist Organization. He's currently the director of research at Qualia Institute. And I honestly believe that Andrés and his colleagues there at Qualia are going to be our generation's Terence and Dennis McKenna. And so I feel very privileged to be able to get in there on the ground floor as he's kind of like, rising up and coming into sort of a bigger awareness. In this conversation, we cover a multitude of topics from psychedelics and how hyperbolic geometry maps onto the visual space within the experience, consciousness, suffering, some of my own experiences. So it's a really good, long, in-depth conversation. I could have talked to this guy all night. I am going to leave a couple of links in the description below to some of Andrés' earlier talks. I would say it's useful to have seen those before watching this video. I don't think it's absolutely critical, but it does help flesh out some of this terminology of like hyperbolic geometry and stuff like that. So I'll put that in the description below. But without any further ado, I bring you Andrés Gómez Emilsson from the Qualia Institute. Enjoy. Okay, I'm on the line with Andrés Gómez Emilsson, who is the Director of Research for the Qualia Institute. Andrés, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you've got to say on a number of topics. I guess a good starting point would be if you could just describe in your own words, what is the Qualia Institute and what kind of things do you do there?
Yeah. No, it's first of all, it's a pleasure to be with you. I've definitely watched a number of your videos and I'm a fan. It's really cool stuff.
Stop it, Andrés.
Yeah. Okay, so I think kind of like the big picture here is we're doing three things. So we're doing philosophy of mind. That's kind of like the first kind of like a component. Second is neuroscience, and then neurotechnology. Okay. And this is with the idea that if you have a better philosophy of mind, if you kind of can actually like model consciousness better in some substantive way, you should be able to generate predictions in neuroscience. Yeah. And more so with better neuroscience, you should be able to make better neurotechnology, ways of altering consciousness in beneficial ways. And that's kind of like, the big picture of the three things that we're doing. There's another kind of like very big component to it, which is our emphasis on valence. And valence is basically the pleasure-pain axis, basically how good or bad an experience feels. And whereas other consciousness researchers think of, for example, as like a color qualia, or maybe taste qualia, as kind of like very, very basic and fundamental. Mm-hmm. We almost kind of like flip it over and we think that valence might be one of the most fundamental qualia out there. And things like color and taste and touch are potentially actually much more complicated and more difficult to model. So we're kind of like flipping it over, and we have some proposals for actually what we think valence might be. And I guess kind of where we're at as an organization is on basically fundraising to actually be able to conduct some of the critical experiments to be able to basically falsify the theory of valence that we have.
Okay. So when just so I understand correctly, when talking about valence, is this kind of like a binary? This experience is good, this experience is bad. Is it, or is this? Are you measuring on some kind of continuum? How can you just kind of flesh that out a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. So there's really kind of like three components of valence on a given experience. There is the positive, there is the negative, and the neutral. Okay. This is something that, in a sense, has been pointed out as properties of experience for thousands of years. Like in Buddhism, for example, they talk about the emotional qualities of experience as being separate from just like mind and sensory qualities. So a given experience usually tends to be a highly mixed valence. So you will have positive valence in some channels, negative valence in other channels. and a lot of neutral valence. I would say, in a sense, kind of the bulk of experience is neutral. Like particular colors, for example, don't have any intrinsic valence. You can look at a blue screen and just experience a completely neutral emotion out of that. Of course, if you kind of like delve into the associations of what a blue kind of like makes you think about, then maybe it might spark positive or negative valence. But another way to look at this is kind of taking a 5-second snapshot of a song. So in some sense, like the song could be on a positive, the overall gestalt of the song could be on a positive or negative note. However, if you analyze the overall kind of like the sound structure in more detail, you will see that there's a lot of usually dissonant components and consonant components, and there's some noisy components. And in a sense, like music is very complicated,
Sure.
but it does reduce to some relatively simple mathematical equations when it comes to computing kind of the overall consonance of the state or the overall dissonance of the state.
Yeah.
And that's kind of how we're thinking about this, that yes, states of consciousness are very complicated and very intricate in how emotion and valence fits into it. But on the whole, you can get a kind of big picture account of how you're feeling by looking at some of the structural features of the experience. And in particular, making the analogy with music, looking at the degree of consonance versus dissonance. What is the balance there?
Yeah, I suppose, is it something where it's a lot of these things are firing at the same time? You think of some experiences, typically the ones that we remember the most, the excitement of being on a roller coaster, or, or when we're in trouble with your parents or something. There's actually like a lot of different things so particularly like the roller coaster example, there's an element of fear. So that would be this kind of negative valence, I guess, coming in. But then there's also the excitement of it's a roller coaster, it's awesome. So I guess the true experience is a kind of a mishmash of a gestalt, as you say, of all these things together. Would that be, I'm on the right track?
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Most experiences are very mixed. There are experiences that are very pure in their valence. I mean, one example is jhanas in meditation. Basically, these like states of very high levels of concentration. They're subjectively reported as generally extremely positive and in a very purely positive way. Like it's not like positive with some mixed in anxiety or mixed in depression. It's just like a pure, bright feeling of well-being. And I guess like in the space of looking at psychedelic like substances, probably the thing that would push you more towards kind of a pure positive valence would be something like MDMA. Kind of has like a overall positive valence effect across all channels, in all frequencies. Everything kind of feels better. And that's definitely an interesting puzzle. Like why something could possibly do that.
Do you think there might be something there that the more positive end result valence ends up as a result of it being this mishmash of the negative stuff? So I'm thinking of an example of if you ever watch, say, like a martial arts fight, and you can imagine the just cocktail of emotions that as you go into that sort of fight, you're nervous, you're excited. When they win, they go bananas. It's like, yes, this is the best thing ever. And I think there's a similar sort of thing, particularly with something like like ayahuasca or a difficult psychedelic experience where, with ayahuasca, there's a lot of darkness and vomiting and sort of discomfort, but then you come out the other side and it's more, I would say, more blissful than these kind of MDMA states. Yeah, and I wonder if that's the sort of the payoff that you get for the suffering, basically, or is the suffering a necessary component of the positive experience?
Right. So I would distinguish here between what's true for humans and human brains, or even biological brains, and then what's true universally. So I am of the mind that it's possible to construct a brain that only experiences gradients of well-being. Like it never suffers, and it could still be extremely intelligent and compassionate, and a lot of the positive attributes that we associate with the benefits of having suffered, I think we could probably just program them right in from the start. However, when you're looking at an evolved creature like humans, in some sense, there's a lot of very positive states that can only be achieved by exploring state spaces that also contain pretty negative components. Actually, I mean, this comes up a lot in like kind of our theory of psychedelic action, and I'll probably walk you through the full thing. But like one key component here is this concept of annealing. So you've probably heard like in if you heat up a metal and you let it cool slowly, the atomic lattice will reorganize in a more smooth and symmetrical way.
Yeah, sure.
And likewise, you can think of a psychedelic state as increasing the overall energy of your consciousness, which allows you to explore many possible configurations very quickly in a very unconstrained way. And then if you cool down slowly, then you may be able to kind of anneal very harmonious and very positive states of consciousness. And I think like that's kind of what you're describing of, ayahuasca pushing you into these very highly energized states, and you explore many configurations. And then when you find something suitable, kind of a good compromise of ethics and a compromise of sense of well-being and responsibility, then you cool down on that. And yes, that's probably going to feel better than MDMA.
Yeah. Which is not to say that MDMA doesn't feel good. just to clear. So just out of curiosity, how did you guys get started at Qualia? Or was it like you met at university or something, or what's the story there?
Yeah.
I've kind of got this romanticized picture in my head of this kind of typical university party where everyone's getting high and talking about how they're going to change the world, and let's do more drugs and we'll change the world. And just like where the rest of us went to bed and then woke up with a hangover, you guys actually went ahead and did it. Please tell me it was something like that.
Probably some elements of that. Let me see. I mean, I've got to say definitely. There's this thing I call hyperphilosophia, which is an obsession with the nature of reality, and I think like a certain percentage of the people have it, like this intense, need to understand reality. And I would say I've been suffering from it from a very early age. Now, the difference was that early on, I thought that kind of the answers to the universe would be revealed exclusively by math and physics, kind of like this very reductionist scientific approach. And it really only was when I was like around 16 years old that I realized that consciousness is a very unsolved problem. and more so, kind of like this whole line of argument of, there's a lot of experiences that make you feel that we are one consciousness. Like there's this sense of unity and non-duality. But then there's also philosophical arguments in favor of that view. And having had some experiences like that when I was around 16, it made me realize that, hey, there could be something to these beyond just the feeling of it. So for the next probably about like 4 years, my main focus was on basically writing the most concise and clear argument for why we're all one consciousness. And I thought of that could be kind of a way of a foundation for ethics, basically. So kind
of drill down. So when we talk about us all being one conscious, this is the sort of the belief that even right now we are just instances of the same consciousness. Is this here? And all through time. So I am Hitler and the Jews, and is that the right track? Yeah. Yes. Okay.
I would just for the sake of vocabulary, I would say. That view, we call it open individualism.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, and that is kind of in contrast with closed individualism, which is the common sense view. Like you start existing when you're born and you stop existing when you die.
And it's just not nothingness on either side, kind of.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Or maybe reincarnation. You could be a closed individualist and believe in reincarnation, but you're still this one stream, separate.
Right, yeah, okay.
And then there's empty individualism, which is you're only a moment of experience, and from 1 second to the next, that's a completely different observer, completely different subject. And I think a lot of the things that really kind of like got my attention early on was basically all of these thought experiments of, well, what if I make a perfect copy of yourself? right? Atom by atom. If you identify identity with, the structural properties of a brain, then that would have to be you. Or, for example, what if there's the classical examples of split brain patients that they seem to have two streams of consciousness. But you could even actually, you could actually do these in a reversible way. It's called the WADA test, where you inject pentobarbital in only one artery that goes to only half of your brain. So half of the brain falls asleep. And the other half of the brain is awake, and you can interact with it and conduct psychological tests, and then you can reverse it and then make the other hemisphere asleep and the previous one awake, and then like you can basically wake up entirely. And there's like this very weird thing of kind of like when you were lefty, you had no recollection of being righty, but when you wake up, you have recollection of both streams. It's like, okay, this thing really challenge. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, because that's, the whole split brain thing is super interesting. I always wondered what it was it that at the moment you make the slice, is that when you make the two people, or were the two people always there, and it's just that this has kind of manifested it? I think that's what you just said then seems to support that. Yeah, it's always like that. You're always these kind of two people. maybe one's coming to the front more often than the other one. But yeah, if you take one out of action temporarily, then it's two individuals. I mean, I'm not sure how I feel about.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and the fact that you can do it. I mean, it's obviously it's not a risk-free like procedure, but you can definitely do it. And they do it for treating epilepsy, basically seeing which part of the brain you shouldn't mess with when it comes to like surgery for the purpose of eliminating the sources of epilepsy. But and I guess as an aside here, an interesting future methodology from the WADA test would be to, rather than just inject pentobarbital to basically put half of your brain to sleep, you could potentially inject LSD into just half of your brain and have the other half of the brain sober. And I think that would probably be a very, very helpful for actually studying altered states of consciousness, because if you have a half of your brain is sober and it can basically still continue to talk normally, but it has access to this unusual phenomenology. I think that could be a very fruitful way of exploring consciousness very efficiently.
and that's theoretical right now. It's not somebody tried it.
Nobody has tried that. That's just hypothetical.
You want to get that on the agenda of the Qualia Institute. That's interesting.
I guess I got a little bit sidetracked, but just to kind of complete the story here, really the idea of Qualia Research came up thanks to David Pearce, which is a pretty influential transhumanist philosopher. I was one of the co-founders of the Stanford Transhumanist Association, and we invited him for a talk. And it was actually talking to him that I came to the realization that sure, there can be all of these good arguments for oneness and open individualism, but you could believe in open individualism and still be clinically depressed or experience chronic pain or experience anxiety. Like it's something that will help you if your main problem is fear of death, for example, or something of that nature. But it's not going to help you if actually you have a deep-seated physiological problem that is causing suffering.
Or even if you have a problem with just coming to terms with the amount of suffering that you may have caused yourself, even, that I can imagine it's one of those, if you are the wrong state of mind, that could be the thing that collapses you completely.
Yeah, definitely. So I think, that's I kind of like, it dawned on me that we needed kind of a twin approach of, in a sense, like a kind of like philosophically rigorous non-duality together with a deep understanding of pleasure and pain, basically what makes experiences positive or negative. And it was kind of like in that exploration that I met Mike Johnson, one of the co-founders, and later Romeo Stevens, who is kind of an advanced meditator, and he actually can access the various jhanas which is really helpful to have somebody in the team who can actually have those states of consciousness. Yeah, we decided, there's this gap in the scientific literature of nobody kind of like creating formal mathematical models for pleasure and pain. And we decided it was important enough to actually dedicate our our time to it.
Yeah. So is this a full-time job for you guys? Is this what you do 9 to 5, or is other project? Is this a project as well as something else?
I was a full-time data scientist at several companies in San Francisco for many years, and I kind of had my research project on consciousness on the side. But I mean, it came to a point where I was realizing that I spent 7 out of the 8 hours of work thinking about consciousness and psychedelics and the nature of being, that I realized I really had to do it full time. So it's been about a year that we're doing it full time.
Excellent stuff. So I mean, I first became aware of you because of your YouTube video on hyperbolic geometry within the DMT experience, which I thought was just absolutely superb. And I'm going to put a link in the description below when I publish this video. I really strongly recommend that my audience go and check it out. I mean, I won't say it's completely necessary for some of the things we're going to talk about now, but it might lay a bit of a foundation. So maybe if you're listening to this and you've not seen that video, maybe pause now and go and click the link below and then come back and watch the rest of it. But the thing that struck me when I was watching that video was just how much it made sense and very accurately described my own experiences of this kind of DMT space. Now, one question that came to mind when I was watching this is, how do you go about doing this kind of research on like the nature of an experience that's just so notoriously slippery? I mean, like in my case, when I'm doing it, it's very vivid and I feel like I understand it. All these tools are available to me to understand what's happening. But as soon as I'm coming out of that experience, it all starts going offline and I'm back to being a monkey again. And it's like, duh. So what are you guys doing there? How do you kind of hold on to this experience enough to be able to form cohesive ideas for it? Do you have some kind of like technique that us mortals haven't figured out yet, or what does that research look like? I'm wondering.
There's a few things off the top of my head. So number one is this distinction between focusing on what's called the intentional content of an experience versus focusing on the phenomenal character of it.
Okay.
So the intentional content is basically what the experience is about. And on psychedelics, the experiences are about a lot of things, right? Like it is not just crazy patterns, it's also a lot of emotional processing, a lot of philosophical processing, and kind of like spiritual insights and all sorts of
all this meaning and
hyper meaningful.
Yeah, that's a great term for it.
And meaning in the very in very formal sense of like how many imports, sensory imports, each of the symbols that you think of comes with, right? Like if you're on a psychedelic and you think of the word home, it's gonna come up with so many more images and emotions and thoughts. So in a sense, you have kind of an enriched ability to think and compare possibilities because of these enhanced number of associations. In some sense, that is a very intrinsic part of the experience. At the same time, it really distracts you from paying attention to some of the other, what we could call low-hanging features of the experience. Okay. Things that are there, but they may not seem that significant relative to what you're actually undergoing at an emotional and meaning aspect of your experience. However, it may turn out to be that actually a lot of those low-level features are, in a sense, the building blocks for what is enabling you to actually think differently. And one of the key things that emerge here is, for example, is the tracer effects, right? A lot of people take a psychedelic and they have tracers, and you ask them, it's like, well, were the tracers kind of like a key component of the experience? And they might say something like, well, it was kind of a nice to have, it was kind of like a nice, fireworks, but that really wasn't what the experience was about. However, if you introspect further, you may come to realize that the tracing is in some sense partly what is enabling you to think differently. That whenever you come up with a thought, the thought, rather than vanishing quickly, it kind of like lingers for longer in your consciousness. You can kind of think of a experience has a much longer decay function. Things last longer in consciousness. And although this may seem kind of a relatively trivial effect, maybe visually, when it comes to things like emotions and the cognitive component, it's really intrinsic. It's really, to a large extent, what is enabling you to fit so much more content in an experience.
Yeah, I think it's. I get what you're saying with the visual element is kind of pretty, but you're right. There is, I mean, the phrase is always like consciousness expanding, but that does seem what it feels like. It's not just that the visual element is pretty. Your ability to comprehend the visual element is also widened. And I think I saw another one of your talks, or I forget the exact wording, but you referred to it as it's kind of like the recycle bin is not functioning the same way. So whereas like, as of right now, my consciousness is happening in a second to second experience. Within one of those deep experiences, it's actually, I'm experiencing it over maybe, I don't know, just plucking out to like a 5-second period or something. It's all happening at the same time. And that tends to be another characteristic, that you feel that things are happening in parallel across multiple timelines and stuff. Yes. So yeah, I think that's a really good example with this sort of the traces and how, yeah, just how mentally more you just kind of soak it in, really.
Yeah. And in fact, we have parallel to the hyperbolic geometry of DMT experiences, which deal with space mostly. Mm-hmm. There's this other article called the pseudo time arrow, which deals with time. Basically, that on a psychedelic is not only that you experience kind of like this expanded window of the present moment, the spacious moment is larger. It's not only that, but on higher doses, you also experience what we call exotic time, which mm-hmm. is all of these experiences, and I'll just name a few of them, which is, for example, when time loops. The other one is moment of eternity. And an even crazier one is time branching, which is like when you see a friend in the living room and he stands up and kind of is going to the bathroom, but then you see half of it, or a copy of it going to the bathroom and a copy of it going to the kitchen, and kind of you feel like as like the universe is splitting in its possibilities.
Yeah, like all possibilities are happening at the same time. Yeah.
Yeah. So all of those exotic time effects is something that, in some sense, a lot of psychonauts have described, but they didn't necessarily have kind of the right focus on the phenomenal character to try to explain those exotic phenomenal time experiences in terms of simpler phenomena. And in particular, with a pseudo time arrow, we explain a lot of these exotic phenomenal times in terms of a formalization of this tracer effect. Mm-hmm. That in a sense, you can kind of describe, it's a little bit intricate, but basically you can describe an experience as a graph where time is encoded in the causality of the graph. And one of the weird implications of that is that if you let enough time happen and you're experiencing very repetitive input, you may actually get the causality to create a loop. And literally, if you're listening to trance music on a high enough dose of LSD, you really feel stuck in that repeating loop. And I think it's something objectively happening with the way your inner representation of time, how that is being basically turned on itself. Mm-hmm. And so on. Like basically, we're trying to kind of deconstruct a lot of these very weird effects on psychedelics by focusing on simpler effects and how those interacting together can generate this weird effect as an emergent property.
So do you kind of, when you're doing the research, is it, are you going into it with a kind of a hypothesis, or is it, we're just trying to work out which way around is it? Is it like you have an experience and then you're kind of like, okay, well, I think this was that, or are you kind of like, okay, guys, let's go and test out this time theory thing, you know? Just which way around does it kind of work, or?
Yeah. Okay, so a little bit about the methodology. So after I started writing on qualia computing, specifically, I think like 2016, I wrote an article called Algorithmic Reduction of Psychedelic States, which kind of goes into decomposing psychedelic states in terms of few relatively simple effects and their combinations. And it was after that article that I started getting emails from pretty smart psychonauts. And I think like that was a bit of a game changing, because before I might get a kind of an email from somebody who was very enthusiastic about like, hey, I had the experience of being one with God, and like, how do I make sense of that? But after I wrote that article, I would get emails from, for example, like, oh, I'm a PhD candidate in quantum computing at MIT, and I recently had a DMT experience, and I would like to talk about it with you. So that kind of like provided these, in a sense, inertia to momentum to actually kind of like look at it from a more mathematical point of view. So one of the things that also emerges here is that you can get a lot out of experiences like these. Indeed, if you have kind of a guess at first about like a particular effect that you want to study further. An example of this was when I was getting reports of people saying, like, hey, if I take a psychedelic and I look at a texture, I get this symmetrical pattern repetition effect. And having studied a little bit of symmetry before, I thought of like, well, okay, so there's actually 17 possible symmetries. And my question to that person was, did you experience this symmetry? Did you experience this other symmetry? Is there any symmetry that you haven't experienced? Now, in that case, the person didn't pay enough attention originally to actually tell, hey, like what symmetry was I looking at? But thanks to some work by a mathematician who's a friend of mine, who created a tool to help you train to be able to tell what symmetry, what wallpaper symmetry you're looking at. This person became pretty fluent at basically looking at a symmetry and be able to say like, oh, that's star 442 or that's 632, just like really quickly tell. And after they become kind of pretty good at that, then repeating the experience, they were able to see all 17 wallpaper symmetry groups in the symmetrical pattern repetition. So that's kind of like a case where there was a kind of like an educated guess at first. And then there was kind of a further experimentation in order to see like whether all of the possibilities were realized.
So do you think it's that it sounds like you started with a kind of a higher caliber of trip report, or like somebody who's got a more mathematical understanding of it? Is that the way it came about? So that's just so rather than the typical like the person like me, like, oh my God, I saw this and it was awesome. You've got somebody who's got a much more structured mind, being able to sort of report the experience to you, and from, is it from that then you then basing your theories upon? Yes,
that and basically the loop of hey, like this suggests a hypothesis, how about we try it out? Like, well, basically I would write them an email, and a month later they would come back and say like, hey, I did try it. This is what happened.
So I'd like to sort of dive in a little bit to the hyperbolic stuff, but I think it probably useful for my audience. Could you just explain a little bit, what do we mean by hyperbolic geometry? Because it sounds awesome, but yeah, what's the difference between this and regular geometry?
Yeah. So regular geometry is what's called Euclidean geometry or flat geometry, and I mean, most people when they go about explaining hyperbolic geometry, they tend to focus a lot on Euclid's fifth postulate, which is this idea that if you have a line and you have a point outside the line, there's only one parallel line to the first line that goes through that point.
Sure.
And in Euclidean geometry, that's true. In spherical geometry, there are no parallel lines. No matter what, you will always meet. And in hyperbolic geometry, there's an infinite number of parallel lines. At the same time, I mean, this is true, but it doesn't really give you a feel for what would a hyperbolic space look like. And in the presentation, what I kind of like went for was to make an analogy with leaves, because there you actually see a lot of interesting hyperbolic structure. That kale, the thing that all of millennials love to for health purposes. And well, it actually turns out to have a bunch of oxalate. It might give you kidney stones. It might not actually be that good of a food, but it's tasty. And one thing that you notice is that if you put lemon or lime on your kale, it feels very juicy. And partly is because it's all wrinkly. It has all of these like surface where the juice can attach itself to, or the dressing. So it's a wonderful kind of like dressing salad, and that is because it's hyperbolic. Basically, all of these little folds, it's kind of like the signature that happens when you're trying to take something that is hyperbolic and put it into a Euclidean space. Basically, you're kind of like forced to bend it and contract it or fold it so that you can fit all of that surface area. If you try to take a kale and flatten it, which is an interesting experiment to do, you always feel kind of like you're pushing elsewhere, kind of the curves. You never can quite flatten it entirely.
I think the leaf analogy is a really good one. So that's how I got my head around it. Just the flat leaf versus the leaf that's kind of caving in on itself and trying to find new ways to maximize its space or whatever. So that kind of explains a little bit on the hyperbolic thing. I'd kind of wanted to dive a little bit into the phenomenon when you referred to it as being blissful, and you sort of went through these different gradings of, which I think you mapped onto dosages. Like the higher the dosage, then the sort of the more extreme the geometry becomes, and eventually you'll go through states where it's either blissful and kind of pleasing and becoming sort of pleasingly complex, through to I think what you described as turbulence, where it starts becoming noisy and sort of maybe sort of distressing. I just wanted to wonder, like, what are your thoughts on how that kind of that blissful feeling, how that the visual element connects to the emotional element of the experience? Because sometimes I'm speaking from my own experience here, but sometimes like you start there watching the experience and you're having this kind of it's invoking bliss, but then sometimes the exact same blissful shapes, which the minute earlier blissful, suddenly turn and can begin to invoke sort of unease or even fear or something. So is there a correlation? Is it that the visuals are invoking bliss, or are the visuals manifesting your emotional state? I'm just trying to, again, it's a chicken. What's the situation though? Which do you think comes first?
This is there's so much to unpack in here. So
okay.
I'm gonna come out and say, I do think there's a right way of actually clarifying all of these. It's a little bit subtle, but hopefully you can bear with me. So this kind of like alludes a little bit back to the intentional content versus phenomenal character. That if you're in a psychedelic state and you're feeling anxious, there's two, in a sense, completely different reasons why that may be happening.
Mm-hmm.
In the first reason is because of the intentional content. Basically, you're thinking of something that is very anxiety producing.
Mm-hmm.
And there's like a whole category of possible things that may be generating that.
Yep. And
then there's another, which is a purely structural type of anxiety that, in a sense, I would describe it as the particular mixture of brain harmonics that you're having right now are creating high frequency dissonance. And it's not because of what you're representing, and it's not because of what you're thinking about, but it's basically a combination of your set and setting, your brain structure, and the dose. And like that particular combination generates this dissonant state. Now, because the mind tries to identify the source for any kind of positive or negative experience, largely so that it can replicate it or avoid it in the future, something very interesting happens, which is that if you're experiencing the psychedelic anxiety of the second type, the mind will be very busy trying to find a reason for that unpleasant quality. If you look at kind of like a lot of the literature on how to deal with a difficult experience, so this sense of try to let go and embrace the experience and so on, I think in a sense that's a psychological hack for you to stop looking for why am I feeling this way, and which is something that in a sense contracts your experience, and instead just let the dissonance resolve on its own, which is something that in most cases will happen, unless you have a very unfortunate type of brain, which I suspect there's probably some people who do have always negative experiences, but I think that has to do with their physiology. So, and I would say like the same with the other analogy here is with music. So there are two very different reasons why music can be pleasant. First one is for social reasons. You know, looking at this is basically a super stimuli for a lot of people. Is like, you know, like a pop artist, very very young looking and very beautiful voice that indicates a lot of health, and like the person is fit, and there's a bunch of attractive people in the chorus, and all of these things that you can think of as like for Darwinian reasons we are attractive to us. But then there's like this other side of music which is strictly based on patterns. Like, why would classical music trigger like intensely rewarding experiences on people who can appreciate that music? And we think it has actually much more to do with hacking a particular symmetrical or harmonious pattern of brain activity. Now, the crazy thing here is that even when you take the other route, basically the intentional content route, the route of like, oh, you're looking at very pretty people and like it seems very healthy and whatnot, even that, in a sense, is triggering also states of harmony, except that those are kind of like hard-coded. I mean, it's like the pleasure of an orgasm, for example, is something that is very, very, very ingrained to the structure of our nervous system. And it's almost kind of like you can reliably experience pleasure that way. People will reliably feel good by looking at attractive people, for example. But if you give them an opioid antagonist, that effect will stop happening. So in a sense, like the question is kind of like, are the patterns that you're providing directly modifying the mood, or are they first triggering an intentional content that then modifies the mood? And those have to be treated separately.
Okay, and just in the term of turbulence that you mentioned, so just for my audience, turbulence was it was a point at which the geometry is kind of rotating sort of too much that it becomes hard to comprehend and just becomes sort of noisy. Is that an adequate description?
Yeah. So I guess I could try to explain a little bit further. So there's like this diagram of the energy versus the information content.
Yeah.
And energy is mostly just dose dependent. The information content is much more set and setting, and also depending on your own previous experiences. And you basically make a trajectory. Whenever you take DMT, for example, you will kind of like shoot definitely always upwards because it's increasing energy, but it could be just upwards. It could basically be just these super symmetrical, like hyperbolic honeycombs, these like very, very amazing resonance structures or crystal worlds, also as they call it. Or it could also be very chaotic, where basically you allow turbulence to happen. So, I mean, a classical example of turbulence is when you have two liquids of different densities. If you first have the higher density liquid on the bottom and the lower density on the top, and they're flowing, that flow is gonna be laminar, as they say. Basically, it's just like very, very smooth.
Sure.
But if you flip over the pipe, then we'll have like this turbulence, because the more dense liquid is mixing up with the less dense, and you will basically get like this emergent chaos out of it. And I think a lot of things in the basically human brain are generators of turbulence. You can think of anxiety and things that cause anxiety as, in a sense, making you have an unpleasant experience by slightly tweaking how your brain works such that it generates turbulence. Now, the other component here is that without that, you also have no information. And while in a sense, the purely blissful, purely symmetrical states are maximizing bliss, they're maximizing the feeling of well-being, they may not actually help you for problem solving. Like if you're kind of like trying to deal with an inner emotional problem or even an intellectual problem, like a mathematical puzzle or something like that, actually shooting first towards a little bit of the chaos side may be beneficial, because that allows you to explore many possibilities very quickly. And then as you're coming down, you can anneal into perhaps the more symmetric or more pleasant states, but you kind of do require that trajectory to do useful computation, to do useful thinking.
Okay. So just coming back to the what we were talking about with valence earlier. So, you know, if you're mapping out this space, you know, you've got like the geometry, which is blissful, which would then be a positive valence, I would guess you interpret. But I've certainly experienced myself states where I've been looking at these positive states, and then just on a dime, it's flipped on me, and suddenly the kind of it's just felt wrong. So suddenly, but it's exactly the same things, you know, shapes and stuff that I'm seeing. So what would that look like on the kind of, when you're trying to map valence? It seems like the waters get murky quite quickly there.
No, and I agree that sounds like a counterexample to this idea that the most symmetrical states are the more blissful. The thing I would actually point at in there is that part of the state is not only the spatial geometry, but also the time geometry. And if you're experiencing a change in mood, but the shapes are identical, I would suspect that the time geometry changed, even though the spatial geometry remained the same.
Yeah.
And I mean, if you introspect, for example, on like anxiety, you will notice, like if you're like in a very peaceful state, you will notice kind of this regularity to your biorhythms. If you enter an anxious state, you will notice kind of these slightly more chaotic, spontaneous, and unpredictable biorhythms. And likewise, on a psychedelic anxiety, your experience of time will be a little bit chopped off if you're having an unpleasant state. Although, even though the geometry could be very blissful. The other thing I would point out, and this is really crazy, is that very pleasant states are also very close to very unpleasant states. And the analogy here is, imagine like taking an orchestra playing a beautiful song, and then taking a copy of that orchestra, but make them all play in a slightly lower key. And then have both orchestras play simultaneously. So that is going to sound really bad, because it's kind of maximizing the number of clashes, the amount of dissonance that you're producing.
Yeah, that's a horror movie soundtrack kind of
Yeah, exactly. So one of the things in this space is that if you're in a very blissful state, something that can happen on psychedelics, and we should try to figure out how to potentially prevent, is that because of the tracer effect, you can kind of superimpose a copy of the state, but slightly modified. And then those two are going to be clashing very intensely. And that's kind of like how, from a very positive state, you can very quickly, randomly enter into a very dissonant state by kind of like overlapping of a failed copy of itself.
Yeah, that actually, as you explain that makes a lot of sense. Because when I've been in one of those states where, again, I've been in some kind of utopian super society and it's just been all awesome. And then, as I say, you suddenly get this feeling that it's going wrong, but it's exactly as it was before. And that knowledge that as you're looking around, it's thinking, this was perfect a minute ago. Then that multiplies the anxiety, because you're, again, and it takes a while to go into full on nightmarish full introspection with everything. So but yeah, that mismatch of the beautiful visuals, but then this feeling of unease, it kind of, I think that might be, along with the tracer effect you're talking about, it's this multiplier, which is what makes the bad experiences just so hellish, because it just keeps stacking on top of itself.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, just showing a little bit about my own nightmarish journeys there. I wanted to ask you a little bit about sort of what's thought of as kind of, very spiritual experiences, which is, typically you've got science over here and sort of, spiritual stuff over here. Do you see your work as being like the final marriage between these two domains? Is like, is your research, are you looking to get to the core of spirituality, or is it more like kind of like biology and what you were just saying about sex, in whereby, biology explains the mechanics of sex, but it doesn't explain the meaning of why you feel like this to this person? Yeah. So is this something you're looking to get to? Are you trying to get into the meaning of it, or is you staying kind of at the mapping things level?
No. We are. I mean, it sounds insane, but yeah, we are actually trying to figure out what the spirituality is all about. I mean, like when example is these states of like non-duality. Why do they often come in also profoundly either profoundly positive or profoundly negative states of emotion, affect, and that I think also can be explained. I mean, all of those kind of like spiritual experiences that people have, I think there's a way of explaining them in terms of basically qualia formalism, understanding consciousness mathematically, and valence structuralism, basically understanding that how good an experience feels has to do with the structure of the experience. So a lot of people talk of, for example, realizing that the ego is an illusion, or kind of like merging with the universe around them. There's a way of understanding all of those experiences in terms of topological modifications to the field of awareness. That, and this is some work by Stephen Lehar in particular comes to mind, where he figured out that basically most experiences are kind of a combination of three different fields added together, which is the field of sensations like colors and vision and touch. Then there is proprioception, which is your sense of where your body is and sense of position.
Okay.
And finally, what he would describe as kind of the kinesthetic force field, which is basically something that you're kind of like constantly modifying in order to move your own body. Like in some sense, he would argue that you're modifying the forces in the kinesthetic force field in order to move your hand around. And you can use the force field as kind of also a way of understanding how attention is circulating in your experience. So one of the things that you can do on meditation or psychedelics is that you may first realize that usually there's kind of this back and forth between paying attention to the environment and then paying attention to the self.
Yeah.
And that kind of creates this division within your internal experience. But if you anneal, if you again like heat up and let it cool slowly, you can get a kinesthetic force field where all of the arrows are pointing in the same direction. And that feels like there's no separation between an internal self and the environment. It all feels part of the same flow, which is very interesting because in this way, we're kind of putting a mathematical structure to this sense of egolessness, that in a sense, you may literally become topologically different by doing these practices. That it's not only that your emotions are different, it's also that the structure of your field of awareness changes. And I guess, I to put a bit my cards on the table, I think I don't think you're literally merging with an external reality or universe, but because part of our internal world simulation includes this wider reality, you are merging with that. But that is kind of in a sense getting rid of internal boundaries that were creating that illusion of separation that was inside of you. In a sense, you're reconnecting with yourself, eliminating these fuzzy boundaries.
Okay, just coming back to the with the geometry stuff.
Yeah.
There seems to me that there's like another visual level on top of that. I'm wondering, is something you would agree with that? I would say almost sometimes it seems like the geometry is a kind of a backdrop, and then there's another level where you can see more like anthropomorphic shapes, or where people start reporting seeing deities or ancestors or stuff like that. Is that something that you've come across? Is the hyperbolic stuff the kind of the be all and end all of it as far as you're concerned, or is there more layers to come that you're still mapping?
No. It's definitely the beginning, and definitely low hanging fruit, as I was mentioning. So, there's, I mean, in mainstream neuroscience, the typical approach to, for example, explaining like entities and archetypes, which, I mean, it's completely true that you can experience them like as clear as day if you're taking off DMT. Like it's a real property.
I've had times where I have been sat like talking to myself as clearly as I'm talking to you now. It was sort of the universe personified through me, because it was me I needed to listen to, I guess, at that point.
Yes. So, no, absolutely. So, kind of like you can think of in mainstream neuroscience, they think about it in terms of like different levels of the visual hierarchy. Mm-hmm. That upper layers of the visual cortex identifies like more higher level percepts, such as like tables, or like your grandmother, or something much more specific, as opposed to low level features in the visual hierarchy, like edges and colors and locations. Mm-hmm. I think that is not enough, but to actually explain these things, because there's also these, especially in things like DMT, this sense of the feeling of an independent existence of other entities. And one way in which I think you can plausibly make sense of this is kind of like coming back to this idea of an experience is the superposition of these three fields, of the sensory, proprioception, and the force fields, kinesthetic force fields, that usually some region of the force field is identified as you, and it has basically a connection with your motor areas that you can actually control the avatar, in a sense. Mm-hmm. But if you excite the field, you add a lot of energy to it, you may start getting more than just one of these little wrinkles or twirls, and you may have like more of those, and those would potentially be the experience of alternate entities as well. Mm-hmm. And I think, like, I mean, something I've been working on that hopefully adds a little bit of light into these is that in some sense, this notion of narrative voices, I'm sure you've encountered like first person account, second person, third person, is very limiting, because in a sense, your experience of the world can actually be generalized. So for example, on DMT, I would claim that a lot of the interactions one may have with an entity feel much more, is not only just first person or second person narrative voice, it's kind of like a 1.5 person narrative voice, where you're kind of like part of that entity is instantiated with your own features, and part of it is kind of like talking to a different entity. There's this sense of like telepathy. I would say telepathy as an experience is kind of a 1.5 narrative voice. Mm-hmm. And then you also have these even weirder like hybrids experiences. If you excite the fields with a large enough amount of energy, you can get the entire field to converge. And in a sense, you feel like you become the field. I mean, similar to what I was describing, all the field lines pointing in the same direction. And that might feel kind of a universal observer. It's not even kind of partitioned into like, oh, there's this part and there's this part. It's more kind of like, oh, there's God. And God doesn't even need to talk, because if you're just one entity, why would you even develop language, right? Like it already knows everything. And in that sense, you can think of that as a zeroth narrative voice. So, I guess I would. Do
you think that
just push that idea, like narrative voice? Yeah.
Do you think that the kind of the voices or the intelligence of these entities is anything to do with what we're talking about earlier with the split brain stuff, in that it's, it's there does seem to be a few instances of consciousness within ourselves, and just because of this unifying aspect of the the psychedelics are having on us, maybe it's just the voice of the other side. Is that? Do you think that might be a reasonable hypothesis? Do you want to give me a job, basically?
Let's see. I think actually that's something that Stephen Lehar, a cognitive scientist, he actually thinks something along those lines, that the DMT elves you meet are actually different branches of your own experience. But I would be more of the idea that it's you're overexciting the field, the kinesthetic force field, and that has as a side effect that you kind of like can feel like you can control, at least partially, regions of the field that are usually inaccessible to you. So there's this, again, like the relationship you have with those entities is not really just like you talking to them or you talking to yourself. Is like a weird, intermediate. But I think that can be explained in terms of the shape of the kinesthetic force field, rather than like you literally dividing into two bound subjects of experience.
Yeah. So I suppose a bit of a devil's advocate question for you. For like the average person on the planet, why should they care particularly about what you're doing? Like what's the point? What's the goal? Where are you going with this?
Yeah. So, well, there's three overall objectives, and I think they're all pretty relevant for everybody. So, first of all is eliminating negative extremes. Second is increasing baseline for how good you feel. And the third is achieving new heights to be able to enter super blissful states in a healthy and repeatable fashion. The eliminate negative extremes, as far as I know, we are one of the few organizations that actually recognizes that intense suffering really is kind of like in a category of its own, and the benefit that it adds to people's lives is usually very minimal, and is usually just massively negative. Talking of things such as like cluster headaches, for example, they happen like 1 in 1,000 people, but they, the pain is so bad, it's unimaginable. And actually, they can be treated with psychedelics, funnily enough. And it doesn't seem to be because of the psychedelic effect. It seems to be having something to do with a 5-HT2A receptor, independent of its psychoactive properties. But that's one of the things we're trying to do, is basically push for a change in legislation such that people who have cluster headaches can basically have access to magic mushrooms or DMT. But the only reason why we're actually focusing on something like that is because we take seriously the idea that valence is an objective feature of experiences. That, when somebody on a cluster headaches says like, oh, my experience was 1,000 times more painful than a migraine, that maybe that's not just metaphorical. That like maybe actually if you go out and measure the dissonance of that person's brain, that it will actually come out to be 1,000 times more energetic than like the dissonance of a migraine. And I think like, that's something that, if we could have some kind of like intense suffering insurance, I think like that would be very relevant for everybody. We were even toying with this idea of a necklace that basically contains antidotes to all of the extreme suffering, kinds of extreme suffering, like a little bit of DMT in case you have a cluster headache, a little bit of menthol and iocane in case you're stung by a bullet ant, and basically different antidotes to like extremely painful possibilities.
This would be one of those things where suddenly the amount of people who've got cluster headaches just goes through the roof. Everybody wants that necklace. It's like with the medical marijuana thing. Suddenly everybody's got some medical marijuana problem.
That's funny. That's probably that's might very well happen. Then increasing baseline. Go ahead.
Yeah, what would be once you've kind of done this research, what would be the kind of the technology that you're talking about that would do that? Are we talking about purely something like psychedelics or nootropics or I'm just wondering like what is the vision of how this gets implemented on a grand scale?
Yeah. So there's kind of like three components to it. I mean, the first one is neurostimulation. So we are working on a neurotechnology that basically stimulates the brain through 3 different channels simultaneously, and we're using algorithms that basically seem to drive the energy parameter of the brain to a almost psychedelic-like level, and it may have like all of the positive mood effects of positive psychedelic effects without having to ingest any substance. And I think, that could be very broadly applicable. Most people could probably benefit from it. A little bit further down the line, yeah, definitely like rational design of better psychoactive substances. Basically, I mean, the holy grail would be to find something that produces MDMA-like effects, but in a sustainable, non-neurotoxic way that you could do once a week. And I think that would be just like such a radical, it would have a radical positive effect in culture if people could just actually unwind fully on a weekend and do it reliably every weekend. And then perhaps more controversially, and this comes from David Pierce, kind of like the very sad realization that a lot of unnecessary suffering really boils down to genetics. And I'm talking here about, like, for example, there's like these specific genes, like the SCN9A gene that codes for pain thresholds, and it also related to pain tolerance. So if you have a certain mutation of it, you basically experience very, very low pain thresholds, and everything is kind of more painful. And people who have that mutation tend to be depressed and have anxiety, and that's something we definitely want to avoid. We also obviously don't want to have no pain at all, because people who have mutations of that receptor, of that gene that encodes the shape of the opioid receptor, what happens is that if they don't experience pain at all, they actually get hurt very easily.
Yeah, sure. You wouldn't know you're on fire, kind of thing. Or...
Exactly.
Yeah.
But there is a sweet spot. There's basically a higher pain threshold than the typical person, than the average, but not so high that you don't feel diseases and injury. And people who have that mutation tend to be more energetic, smarter. They tend to have like more interests, and generally be depression resistant. They kind of just don't get depressed. And that's a sort of a slight modification that I think would be, it would pay off dramatically in terms of ethics and the overall happiness of the world, if we could just make sure we don't have we don't let the bad versions of that gene basically to take place.
Just in regards to what some of the things that you're proposing, did you guys kind of like butt heads with the legal situation at all? I mean, is it? I know that the tide does seem to be changing a bit in the US, which is kind of bizarre because it's actually changing a little bit the other way here in Europe. I don't know if you've seen in the news, but
no.
Yeah, the Netherlands, which is historically been like, where they've been very sort of liberal, and that's where sort of, marijuana was legal for years. Well, it still is legal, and they're very liberal with like prostitution and things like that. But they've just made a stand on DMT and ayahuasca, saying no, it's illegal.
Oh.
But yet on the flip side, I'm seeing in the news all this stuff of like, this state in America's legalized this, and like, so America is now the bastion of like legalizing things, and the Netherlands is almost like, what's going on in this world? And I just wondered, are you guys kind of operating freely within whichever state you're in, or are you sort of on the knife edge with sort of legislation, or what does it look like?
Well, I mean, we're not currently giving people any kind of a psychedelic. I mean, all of the work I've described in phenomenology has been basically anonymous people sending me emails, and I can verify that they're really smart and like they know what they're talking about, and kind of like establishing a relationship with them. But it's I can't really know for sure what exactly that they're taking, or it's not a controlled study or anything. But when it comes to one of the very big studies that we're looking funding to actually conduct, that one will require basically be able to legally give a person either MDMA or 5-MeO on and put them on an fMRI. And I think like that's something that will happen. I'm pretty confident, but it's going to be tricky. Like the most likely path is going to be the path that we're examining is basically partnering with a neuroscience lab who already has a permit to administer MDMA or 5-MeO, and basically attach our study to an ongoing study. That seems to be like the most likely scenario. But yeah, I mean, in the long term, we do have the vision of actually getting the permits, especially for those two that I mentioned, MDMA and 5-MeO, that we think are probably the most relevant for understanding the mathematics of pleasure and pain.
Okay.
Yeah, and actually, I was curious. I don't know how much more time we have, but I wanted to.
I'm pretty flexible, but I am conscious of your own time. But if you're good, I'm good.
Okay. Yeah, I'm good. Definitely for another 10-15 minutes. So, I wanted to ask you about your thoughts and maybe a subjective impressions of 5-MeO, since I see you had an experience.
Oh yeah, yeah. It was a very. I mean, there was a lot of differences just in the setting anyway. So typically, whenever I had any other kind of like DMT experiences or ayahuasca experiences, always very dark room, sort of very controlled environment. And when I did 5-MeO, it was out in a forest with a guy who wants you to stand up and like sort of stare at the sun. And I was a little bit cocky going into it because I felt like I was quite experienced with an NDMT, and yeah, it just hit me like a brick, and my motor system just seemed to like shut down. I just could not stay upright at all. But it's definitely got its own character. It's very. I think the way I would describe it is that if the NDMT is very cosmic and very like out there in the galaxy, and that's certainly my experience. It's got a very sci-fi characteristic to it. The 5-MeO seemed very organic and very natural. It was very much more dialed into the dirt and the trees around me. Lots of the imagery I was seeing, again, when we talk about NDMT, it's very sci-fi, very, very tech. This was very. I've seen a lot of like the literal chemical symbols for things kind of floating through the air, and I felt like I was kind of had some insights into the mind of the frog, and I had this kind of like this moment of like loneliness or like empathy for the frog. I was like, is this frog like immune to this substance that it's carrying? Like the frog will never know what this is like because it must have built up some sort of natural tolerance, or is it just always like this for the frog? I was really in this frog mind space. Or I should say, sorry. But yeah, it's something that I'd want to go back and spend some more time with, because the time that I did it was a very on-the-spot decision. I didn't know I was actually going to be doing it until like about half an hour before. I was at this place. I was at a conference with where Dennis McKenna was, and yeah, this guy was just doing 5-MeO ceremonies out in the woods, just next, near it. And I was like, yeah, sure, I'll do that on a Sunday afternoon. What else am I going to do? So I think if I went into it where I was doing it as part of a retreat, then I'd have a lot more intention and perhaps a lot more willpower to, if I was going to do this standing up thing, see where it goes. But yeah, I would definitely recommend it. And I would definitely agree with this general perception that it's a few levels above the regular DMT. It's powerful. Yeah, very.
Yeah. So I mean, we do think it's probably, definitely a different category. But most of all, it's kind of extremely relevant for valence, because there's this sense of, and I mean, maybe you can tell me how much this agrees with your experience, but there's this sense of like profound harmony that happens. like this kind of like full synchronization. It feels like every cell in your body is basically singing in tune with each other.
I would agree with all that. It was, yeah, I think harmony is a very good word for it. Again, to sort of like contrast it with an NDMT. There you have this very much, you know, the roller coaster experience people describe as being like tied to a rocket and stuff. And yeah, that with the 5-MeO, it was much more like everything coming online at the same time. Like the clockwork just meshed perfectly. There was no, you know, new gears, new parts of the machine. Were just everything was in sync. And so yeah, there's this feeling of like I said, harmony is a really good word for it. And like I said, I'd like to explore it more now, having that. I think that was good for a kind of like, okay, this is, now you've got an idea of what to expect. Let's go more. But I've heard of, you know, I've spent a lot of time on these ayahuasca retreats and stuff where people talk about very deep experiences. But then when people talk about the 5-MeO experiences, it's like, you know, and ayahuasca's got a reputation of being the badass, but the 5-MeO seems to, really open people up in kind of almost like a completely different stream. You know, I think that one thing when you've got like the phrase DMT, people tend to think it's all the same. You know, they think, you know, you've got the sort of smoke DMT and ayahuasca is just that, but longer, and 5-MeO is just that, but it comes from a frog. And it's like, no, there's a characteristic to these things. There's an application for these things, and it's very different. I think, if you, my arrogant mistake was thinking that the 5-MeO was just going to be like, it's just more. It's just the other stuff, but it comes from, the gimmick is it's from a frog. I was like, whoa, I got my ass kicked. That's happened to me.
Yeah, no, I really like your description of on DMT, you may experience like all of these different high dimensional gears coming online, and it's very unstable and chaotic state, as opposed to 5-MeO. Like, it seems like everything that comes online gets synchronized with the kind of like the main frame, the thing that is currently ongoing in this big one event, as opposed to all of these different like subcomponents and intricacies.
And so you can do more with it. I think that's probably the other characteristic of it is, I mean, most people will say like an NDMT is just so fast. It's very difficult to bring anything back, and it's awesome, but you don't necessarily get the same kind of like healing experience as what you get with ayahuasca, because I got longer. And I think 5-MeO it does that. So you get the certainly the intensity of the experience from the NDMT, and certainly the short-lived experience. But for some reason, it's more navigational. I don't know what the right word is there, but you can find that space and work with it more. It's not as it's in one sense it's overwhelming, but in another it's not. It's more useful, I guess.
Yeah. So I would like to basically connect this a little bit with the symmetry theory of valence, one of the key things of Qualia Research. So, I mean, this basically would seem to indicate that DMT tends to be a very mixed state, that it has like both very intense dissonance and intense consonance and a lot of information content. Whereas 5-MeO will tend to be a very pure state, like either very, very, very blissful or very, 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 very unpleasant. If you happen to be unlucky and basically get that effect of a slight miscopy of the state interfering with itself, and that could be very unpleasant. The other things too is that there's this aspect that has to do with symmetry as well. That 5-MeO famously tends to generate like this kind of like sense of confusion between what's left and what's right. There's kind of almost kind of like a loss of orientation, which suggests an extremely high degree of symmetry to the state. Also would suggest powerful valence effects. And finally, like this sense of a lack of internal boundaries, which also kind of like comes along with the sense of symmetry. Basically, if you can't distinguish the outside from the inside, in some sense, you have made them symmetrical. And in that sense, you're going to basically feel good about it. It's going to provide a valence quality to it. But yeah, anyhow, that's kind of partly the justification for why we are so deeply interested in doing scientific research on it, because if there is an equation for what bliss and pleasure is, I think in 5-MeO we will find it, because that's kind of the most extreme case of it.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's I'll say a very, very powerful thing. I would definitely recommend it to most people, but it's, yeah, it was an experience. I just wanted to sort of ask you, just in sort of like wrapping up, where are you at in sort of levels of like optimism? Where do you think we're going to be as like a society in say like 50 years time? Do you think we're going to reach this utopian super society that I'm seeing in my visions, or yeah, just where's your level of optimism at for us?
I would say I am a short-term pessimist, but a long-term optimist.
Okay.
I mean, honestly, I do think we are in a difficult world situation, potentially unstable, and I mean, hopefully there's no like big wars or any big catastrophe. But I think given the nature of humans and the amount of stockpiles of weapons, it seems rather likely, unfortunately, that something bad might happen. However, if you take into account also kind of like the long term of biotechnology and the long term of basically technologies to eliminate suffering, I am extremely optimistic. I mean, I think like the mere fact that there are already people out there, they're called hyperthymic, people who basically genetically, they almost never experience suffering. It's already kind of like a proof of concept that humans can live that way, right? That in a sense, like the negative emotions and intense suffering that we experience maybe was adaptive in the ancestral environment, but nowadays there's really no need for it. And then also, yeah, the kind of the science of non-duality. I mean, like the existence of something like 5-MeO DMT to me provides a fantastic amount of optimism. The sense of you could potentially get people who have really, really strong egos or attachments to, their culture, their way of life, to their, the specific beliefs, and you give them 5-MeO DMT, and all of a sudden they realize that they are consciousness, right? Like they stop identifying with things that are kind of these impermanent, low-level things that don't really matter, and they start identifying with what really matters, like the consciousness and the consciousness as a whole. I think like, yeah, honing down exactly what produces those experiences and making them scalable, I think it will change the overall game theoretical landscape. Basically, make it much more easy to cooperate with others because you know that you're in the same team, especially others that you can verify they've had that type of experience before.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you've been very, very generous with your time, André. Just before, go ahead.
No. Well, another thing I wanted to touch upon is like, so you one of the things I really love about your channel is like all these what seems to be very objective reviews of different retreats. And I think like that's so needed. Like like, oh my gosh, like there's, a psychedelic retreat has like so many possibilities to, in a sense, defraud the public about how good it is, because people get, they might have like healing from ayahuasca or from the compound, but then maybe the staff wasn't actually really, good, or it was an unstable location, and all the things that you've talked about. And I guess, there's one very interesting retreat. I don't know, maybe hopefully you'll get a chance to explore it at some point. It's called the Atman Retreat.
Atman Retreat, okay. I shall make a note.
Yeah. So
whereabouts is that based?
It's in Jamaica.
Okay.
And it's
I think I've actually read across this. This is the psilocybin retreat. Is that the one?
Yes.
I do remember reading about it. I think if it's the one I'm thinking of, I think I remember the guy who was running it posted on Reddit or something like that, when he was first doing it. And I remember I really felt for the guy. I thought he got a lot of flack because people I could do mushrooms at home. I'm not going to go to Jamaica to. I think that's. I mean, there's definitely, I think, a lot of pushback against all these kind of retreats, because people just look at the cash value of them and compare it to the cash value of the buying the things on the street. And I can't stand that. I think, the people need to understand the value of what you're getting at one of these things. In that, you're not just paying for a cup of oral DMT. There's a care program that goes around it, and there's particularly if you've got something like depression or PTSD, then I don't think you're going to get the same kind of healing just sat in your apartment, expecting a magic bullet effect just from this substance. Whereas if you've got a structure around you, like a framework to talk you through it and get you through it, then I've seen some like really good, just wondrous sort of healing effects. But the flip side of that, which just to come back to what you were saying about with the reviews, there is a sort of scale of these things. I think there is a thing where people should know what they can expect from one of these retreats, and know what they're getting themselves into. Because I've certainly been on some where it seems they're relying on the awesomeness of the experience to sort of cover up the fact the rest of it was just dog shit, and the staff were grumpy and the food was crap, but people come out of it so high and so glowing that it's like, and then they don't want to hear a bad word said about this. And I just kind of took the opinion like, look, when I first started looking into going on the streets, I wanted what I'm doing now, because I wanted someone just to say, this is good, this sucks, this is worth the money, this is not worth the money, And I don't particularly mind that there's, some of these places are catering to like the super rich or whatever. I think that's fine. If you're going to build an air-conditioned swimming pool out in the jungle, you deserve to get paid for that. Go for it. And whereas some people are kind of very, opposed. They just see the price tag and it's like, jump on it. But the Atman guys, I was looking at that. I was definitely interested because although I've not talked about it much on my channel, I do rate mushrooms very highly. I've just not gotten around to talking about it yet. And also Jamaica sounds awesome. so it's definitely on my list if it's the one I'm thinking about. Yeah. But are you associated with them in some way? Or?
No, not officially. I'm just friends with some of the people who run it, and I respect them very much, just in their integrity most of all. And but the thing that really gets me going about this is that it's because it's in Jamaica, it's actually fully legal. Like psilocybin is actually fully legal there. And what I'm thinking about it with respect to that retreat is, and I've talked about it with the people who run it, and they're very enthusiastic about this idea, is almost kind of make it a seed for a super Shulgin academy. So basically, like it's kind of like it's like bringing people not within a spiritual framework and not within a therapeutic framework, but rather literally to go and investigate consciousness. And I think like because of the legal situation, that it's a fully legal experience, people will be able to actually talk about it and open up about it. So I'm thinking of inviting potentially very, very smart, physicists and computer scientists and philosophers and like really high quality artists to come and have those experiences and document them and answer some of those research questions that we care so much about. And I think it might be, in the future, I do envision, one of my reasons for optimism is in 10, 20 years, I do think there's probably going to be large consciousness research centers where very smart people and ethical people actually take those substances and investigate and basically develop a vocabulary to be able to talk about it with others, rather than all being so shady and like, just anonymous reports and I think, if you could do that, if you could, formalize that kind of group, and if you've got enough influential people in there, and like you say, and it's within this space where there's no taboos about being able to talk about. One of the reasons I feel
okay to talk about is that most of my things is happening away in Peru, so I'm kind of safe to say, yeah, I did this. It was legal where I did it, so there's no kind of blowback on me there. It's not like I'm doing it here in my home. But yeah, I mean, I think that's what's needed. And I think, there's one thing's like a bit of a cliche where you see like Joe Rogan, who's just this mammoth of in the podcasting space, and there's the memes of he's always asking anybody, everybody if they've done DMT or done psychedelics. But the fact that it's getting out there and it's having those conversations, I think it does feel like the tide's changing and that it's becoming to that point where it's not shady or sleazy anymore. It is now socially acceptable, and I think things like when I saw you mentioned the Super Shulgin Academy, I thought, I was like, yes, this is what's needed. And to keep it sort of, pure in that pure sort of academic state, I think that's what it needs to be. If it became a sort of a touristy thing where anybody could get in, it would dilute it a little bit. Which again sounds a little bit elitist, but yeah, I don't think I'd want me to be in the super. I'd want the super intellectuals in the Super Shulgin Academy. I'm happy watching from the sidelines there. But yeah, I'll definitely put the Atman retreat on my list and hopefully get round to it someday.
Fantastic, excellent.
I've got a few quick fire questions just before we go. So just answer them as short as you can, straight off the top of your head. So aliens, yes or no?
Not within our Hubble volume.
Okay. AI, good or bad?
Overwhelmingly good. I don't think AI will be sentient anytime soon. And that has to do with that you can't solve the binding problem in digital computers. But that's a whole topic. But yeah, good AI, but just not sentient AI for a while.
Okay. Consciousness, in the brain or external signal?
Largely in the brain. Although probably some extracranial electromagnetic fields contribute to the topology of your experience, as demonstrated by psychonautics using transcranial magnetic stimulation. At least some slightly surrounding the brain. It's not just completely confined to the brain.
Okay. Favorite psychedelic?
2CB, mostly because people seem to be able to access very good states of consciousness with it very introspectively and psychedelic, but with a positive mood blanket that basically reduces the probability of deeply unpleasant states.
Okay. And finally, sausage made of rainbows or rainbow made of sausages?
Sausage made of rainbows. I'd rather have the... Yes. Plus...
Yeah, the other one's kind of grotesque when I think about it. Okay, well, I must say, mate, like I said, I am conscious of that. It's been awesome to talk to you. Thank you so much. Just before I sign off, is there any particular places or social media accounts, anything you want to mention where people can keep up with you or what Qualia is doing?
Primarily Qualia Computing, Qualia Research Institute.org, and my colleagues' work is also opentheory.net and neurotic gradient descent .blogspot.com. That's the two co-founders. That's their blogs.
Okay. I must admit, I have been, since I saw the hyperbolic video, I have been reading through Qualia Computing. It's an awesome site. It made me feel very stupid, but it's awesome. I'd strongly recommend people go and read it. I do feel like I'm getting a little bit smarter from reading through it.
Thank you. I highly recommend. Probably the best place to start is just Google top 10 Qualia Computing articles, and that's probably a good place to start.
Okay, I will do that. Well, yeah, it's my reading material for the next 6 months, stroke 6 years. Okay, well, thanks again, mate. And also, just good luck with your own work and the work with the Qualia. And I will be eagerly watching from the sidelines. And yeah, just thanks again, and hopefully we'll speak sometime soon.
Fantastic and excellent work with your channel, and look forward to more.
Okay.